I'm Richard Roberts, PhD student at the University of Maryland, alongside my lovely collaborators, Julio and Raley, and my advisor, Dave. Police take possession of tons of personal property during their work, sometimes as evidence or seized assets, or sometimes it's just lost and found that someone turned in. If the police have something and they can't give it back to its owner, it often gets sold to the public at a police auction. Now, if you've heard of police auctions before, you're probably thinking of massive yachts or expensive sports cars, but in the US, police can auction virtually any item that has monetary value, including cell phones. Now, we know cell phones have tons of sensitive and personal data on them, and that brings me to our key question here. Is there sensitive data on police auction cell phones? We'd hope not, but when you look at prior work, sensitive data has been found on devices that were sold at eBay and on pawn shops. So what makes police auctions any different? Normally, the owner sells a phone themselves. But here, there's an intermediary, the police. So the owner might not even know that the police have their phone, let alone that they're selling it. Selling sensitive data would also violate the unique elevated trust that police have, so we might hope and expect them to properly wipe the phone before selling it. Also, since we're dealing with the police, it's more likely that some of these phones came from criminals and potentially could have evidence of a crime they committed. Again, hopefully police would wipe everything from these phones, including criminal evidence, before auctioning them off. The question is, are they wiping these phones before selling them? If not, how easy is it to access data on these phones, and what kinds of sensitive data, if any, are being sold? To answer those questions, we bought phones, we used straightforward techniques to access them, and we looked at what was on them. We bought our phones from the largest police auction website in the United States, PropertyRoom.com. They're a centralized online auction house that works with thousands of police departments all across the US to handle the logistics of auctioning things off, and they sell a lot of phones. Over a 2-year period, they sold 33,000 phones for over $500,000. PropertyRoom sells nicer, newer, refurbished phones, but they also have what they call bulk lot auctions. These are groups of older, broken phones, usually sold 5 to 10 at a time, and when we were bidding, they had this disclaimer on them. Items have not been tested due to lack of batteries and/or chargers. So, if these ones weren't getting refurbished, were they at least getting wiped? So we bid on bulk lots in November 2021 and February 2022. We spent $4,245, and from that we won 40 auctions, each between $400 and $380. And in those 40 bulk lots, we ended up buying 228 phones. To condense all of that, on average, we spent a little over $18 per cell phone. How do we investigate these phones responsibly? In the paper, we go over everyone we consulted with at the EFF, our university's legal counsel, IT, IRB, who approved the project, but here are some of the highlights. Legally, in the US, we own the phones and the data on them, but the CFAA limits how that data can be used. Here's an analogy. Say you bought a new house and you find an old safe in the basement. You own that safe and what's inside of it. Legally, you can break into it. Inside is a piece of paper with someone's password written on it. You own that piece of paper, but that doesn't mean that you can use that password to go log into someone's account. Just to play everything safe, in our work, we prevented the phones from connecting to a network. Responsible research also means protecting ourselves as researchers. CSAM, or child sexual abuse material, is illegal to even have in your possession regardless of how you come across it. And to protect ourselves from CSAM exposure, we passed all images on the phones through a CSAM detection filter before we let any researchers manually investigate them. We used Microsoft's PhotoDNA. PhotoDNA lets companies and researchers create a local hash of an image and check that hash against a database of known CSAM images. And to say it up front, we did not find any, but everyone on the project knew the reporting procedures in the event that we had. Finally, I want to mention, due to the nature of this work, we couldn't get consent from the people who used to own these phones before analyzing their data. We discussed trying to get post hoc consent, but we decided against it for a few reasons, including researcher safety. Okay, so we bought 228 phones, and we know we're allowed to try to get access to what's inside of them. How do we do it? From our starting 228, 60 phones were flat out broken. They were unusable, they didn't have a battery in them, so we set those 60 aside, and that leaves 168 functional phones. Since these phones are being sold to the public, we wanted to know how easy it would be to get into them. What can you do even if you're not a security researcher or a police officer with a forensics toolkit? No matter what, the first thing that you do is charge the phone and turn it on. And for 49 phones, that was all it took. They didn't have locks. Turning them on took you straight to the home screen. So you could hand one of these phones to literally anybody, and they would immediately be able to access everything that was on the phone. 118 phones arrived locked behind pin and pattern locks, which are something that anybody could guess. So we got lists of 100 popular pins and patterns, and for each phone, we manually guessed until we either unlocked the phone or something stopped us from guessing further. That got us into 11 more phones, and 107 are still locked. There's one more phone that was locked, but there was a sticky note on the back that had the pin written on it. And it said the phone had been gray keyed. Gray key is a tool used by law enforcement to crack phone credentials, and normally it's not available to the public, but in this case, that didn't matter because the police had gray keyed the phone for us. We inherited elevated access to this phone because police broke into it already. And we knew that when we were bidding on the phone. The note was visible on the auction page. So this ended up being the auction we spent the most money on because we assumed, rightfully, that we were bidding on a pre-broken into phone. And just for the record, this pin wasn't on our list of popular pins, so we wouldn't have gotten into this phone otherwise. Brief aside, this wasn't a one-off incident. In a 2-year time span, we saw photos of at least 5 more pins and patterns that were put on notes on phones. But to recap the 228 that we did buy, the barrier to access 61 of them, that's over a quarter, was low enough that anybody could do it, no tools, no fancy forensics. 49 because they didn't have locks, 11 had pins or patterns that were easily guessable, and 1 had the pin outright written on the back. Those 61 phones were open books. We could see anything that was on them. So what did we see? I mean, we saw everything. We saw all of the stuff that you would expect to see on someone's cell phone. 18 phones had nude images. 51 phones had browsing histories, some had cookies, some had histories that were synced from devices that we didn't even have control over. 16 phones had login info saved in their autofill settings, so we saw 194 username and password pairs. There were photos of 5 passports, 14 driver's licenses, literally government-issued PII. And of course, we saw all of the calls, all of the texts, voicemails, and emails on these phones. But keep in mind that those go 2 ways. We didn't just have data about 61 people. We saw contact with over 7,000 other unique phone numbers. How old is this data? So if we take a single phone, we can take the timestamp from the earliest phone call or text message and the timestamp from the latest phone call or text message and try to establish a window when someone was actively using that phone. We did that for all the phones that we could, and we plotted them together here. Turns out there was a really big range for our phones. Some of the phones in the bottom left hadn't been used in over a decade, whereas phones in the upper right had been used months before they were auctioned off, so the data on them was fresher. If you can pinpoint where one phone in a bulk lot came from, you know where all the phones in that lot came from, even if you can't get into them. So looking at all the location data, we were able to pin down the state for 35 of our 40 bulk lots. That means we had an idea where 201 of our 228 phones came from. To do this, we looked at home and work addresses in Maps apps. We looked at local web searches, geodata from photos the phones had taken. And some phones made it even easier. They had evidence stickers on the back that explicitly listed the state or police department that they came from. So unfortunately, the police ultimately did sell phones that had sensitive data on them. And not only that, we did also see unwiped phones that belonged to criminals and still had evidence of criminal activity on them. In the paper, we go over 15 case studies for the kinds of criminal activity that we saw, but I want to talk about 3 of them right now. Because those 3 phones belonged to criminals, and their phones had stolen data from the victims of their crimes. The first of these 3 phones had a screenshot of a website that sells stolen credit cards, and in that picture, we could see details for 11 cards that someone had purchased. And the second example was a member of a group chat on Telegram where you could buy tutorials for committing identity theft and fraud, and the admins of that group gave one victim's data for free to entice the group members to buy more. The third example had 24 stolen Experian and TransUnion credit histories on it. Credit histories are extensive. They have identities, locations, banking information, and 23 of them had the victim's full social security number. Worst of all, this was the gray-keyed phone. Police gave us the PIN that we needed to see all of that victim data. So these people had their data stolen. It was used to commit identity theft against them. Police caught who did it and got their phone, but then they sold the phone back to the public at a police auction, and sometimes they included how to get into the phone after breaking into it themselves. So now whoever buys the phone can use the victim data on it to commit the same crime. Instead of protecting these people and putting a stop to the identity theft, selling these phones puts them back at step one, risking this cycle of re-victimization. We disclosed our results in a few ways. First, to PropertyRoom. We shared our findings with them under an embargo in October 2022, and we offered to meet with them, but they didn't take us up on it. For a while, bulk lots stopped, and then they came back up again, so we bought all of them for about a week. Those phones were all factory reset, but some of them had external SD cards that hadn't been wiped, so we disclosed that too. And now, when you look at bulk lots, there's an additional disclaimer that's been added to them. Devices presented for auction have gone through our internal process to ensure personal information has been removed. Not all police auctions go through PropertyRoom. Some departments still host their own. We'd love to reach out to the tens of thousands of departments in the US, but that's just not feasible for us to do individually. But we did share our results with groups that coordinate with many departments like the National Sheriff's Association so that they can spread our findings to their members. As for recommendations, set a secure lock on your phone. If you lose it, consider wiping it remotely. To the police, wipe phones before selling them, or better yet, just destroy them instead. And for researchers, if you're thinking of using police auctions as a cheap way to buy cell phones for unrelated research, don't. You may be legally in the clear, at least in the US, but these people didn't consent to this, and you're measuring downstream of any number of biases that we just can't control for. In summary, we bought 228 phones from police auctions on PropertyRoom.com. 61 of them, that's over a quarter, were easily accessible, no technical knowledge or experience necessary. Police sold unwiped phones with personal, sensitive, and victim data still on them. And after our disclosure, PropertyRoom now says that they check phones for personal data before selling them. With that, I am happy to take any questions.
Hi, great talk. So you said that PropertyRoom now says they check the phones. Have you, can you certify, or have you checked that they actually do it, or did you just put a label there that they check?
So they put the label on. After our first disclosure, we did buy all of the auctions for about a week to see if they had actually changed any activity. That was actually before they included the disclaimer on it. And those phones had all been factory reset, but factory resetting a phone doesn't always wipe the SD card. So all of the phones that we bought in that time period had been factory wiped, but 4 of them still had photos and other data stored on the SD card.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, my name is Sean Steinley. I'm with MITRE. I was just curious, you mentioned the SD cards, even on wiped phones. Is there any other considerations where even wiping a phone wouldn't delete all the data? Is that a responsible enough way to deal with these phones if you're a police department?
In my opinion, I think the phones should be destroyed. That seems to be the safest way to make sure that no one's data gets sold. I'm not an expert in kind of that level of mobile digital forensics. We did see some phones that appeared to be wiped, but there were a couple of settings that looked like they might have been carried over from the previous time the phone was used. The device name was one of them. So I'm of the opinion that the best thing to do is to just destroy the phones instead of wiping and selling them again. Another point on that real quick too is that we had a lot of different phones from different manufacturers, different versions of Android or iOS or whatever, and it's not always clear the best or most appropriate way to wipe a phone for an individual device. Remember, we're looking at phones from a 10-year time span. So I think it's also very difficult to make sure you can appropriately wipe all of those phones.
Does PropertyRoom sell computers or other devices that might happen like this?
It's certainly possible. They do sell a lot of different electronics equipment, some used laptops that, in my opinion, appear to be more surplus from the police departments, but they're tablets, they're sometimes game consoles. The cell phones were the most prevalent piece of technology that we think came sort of from I guess, consumers or citizens.
I have, I guess, one last question. Have you observed any trend in terms of geographically or along the time in terms of like the type of phones they sell or the type of data that you observe?
Yeah, not particularly. They do say that if they're working with a particular department and that department gives them 200 phones or something like that, they will space them out so that they don't kind of saturate the market all at once. And we, in the paper, we analyzed 2 years of these auctions after crawling their website. And you can see a pretty linear graph when you look at how many phones have been sold over time. So they seem to maintain a mostly constant rate, at least, of phones themselves.
Interesting. So the problem is actually getting worse.
Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you. And thanks for the great talk.